here is something strange. Sometimes the person everyone describes as the nice one is not actually the kindest person in the room. They may simply be the person most afraid of what happens the moment they say no. Think about how ordinary this looks from the outside. Someone asks for a favor you don't have the time or energy for, and you hear yourself say yes before you've even finished thinking about it. Someone speaks to you in a tone that leaves a small bruise, and you laugh, because laughing is faster than confronting what just happened. A friend cancels on you for the third time this month, and you find yourself writing their excuse for them before they've even finished making it. A colleague presents your idea in a meeting as though it were their own, and you sit there and you say nothing because saying something would make the room uncomfortable. And you have spent years being the person who does not make rooms uncomfortable. Someone crosses a line you never agreed to have crossed, and somewhere in your head a familiar sentence appears, fully formed, almost automatic. It's not worth making a big deal about. Each of these moments taken alone looks harmless. A single yes, a single laugh, a single silence. None of them seem like the kind of thing that could cost you anything. But something strange starts happening after enough of them accumulate. People begin to expect your compliance, not because they sat down and decided to exploit you. Usually nothing that deliberate is happening at all, but because your flexibility has quietly become an assumption. Your patience has been reclassified, without a vote, as permission. Your availability has stopped being a gift and started being a given. And then one day, for reasons that may have nothing to do with any single person in your life, you say no, and the room reacts like you've broken a rule nobody told you existed. People look surprised. Some look almost offended, as if you had taken something away from them rather than simply declined to give it. And you're left standing there, running the numbers, trying to understand how being the easy person to deal with somehow turned into being the person other people feel entitled to. How did that happen? That is the real question underneath this entire audiobook, and it deserves a better answer than the one most people settle for. The easy explanation, the one that gets repeated in comment sections and self-help slogans, is that kindness itself is the problem, that nice people finish last, that the world only respects people who are hard, who push back, who take no prisoners. It's a satisfying story because it gives you someone to blame that isn't you, and it gives you a villain, kindness, that you can renounce in one dramatic gesture. It is also mostly wrong. Here's a different possibility, one that takes longer to explain but happens to be true. Respect was probably never being lost because you were kind. It was being lost because your kindness had no boundary attached to it, because there was no edge, no place where your generosity stopped and your own life resumed. People weren't disrespecting your kindness. They were responding reasonably to the absence of anything that told them where you ended and their needs began. This is the central distinction this audiobook is going to spend the next 2 hours building, from as many angles as it takes for it to actually change how you move through your relationships. So let's say it plainly, right at the start, so there's no ambiguity about where this is heading. A person can be warm without being submissive, helpful without being endlessly available, forgiving without tolerating repeated disrespect, calm without being passive, generous without disappearing into the process of being generous. And sometimes, this is the part that tends to make people uncomfortable the first time they hear it. The most respectful thing you can do, for yourself and occasionally for the other person too, is to disappoint someone, not punish them, not humiliate them, not win some invisible contest against them. Just disappoint them, calmly, and continue being who you actually are. We are not going to get to the mechanism of how that works yet. It takes time, and it deserves more than a slogan. But before we go further, it's worth sitting with a few questions, because the rest of this audiobook is really just the long-form answer to each of them. Why do people sometimes respect the person who says no more than the person who has never once said no to them? Why can constant availability quietly reduce the value other people place on your time, even when they genuinely like you? Why does apologizing for every boundary you set make that boundary weaker, almost as if the apology itself gave the other person permission to keep pushing? Why do some people become visibly uncomfortable, sometimes even angry, when someone who was always agreeable suddenly starts being assertive, even about something small? Why does trying to avoid every conflict sometimes produce more disrespect over time, not less? Why is being liked such a dangerous thing to mistake for being respected? Why does saying no feel selfish to so many people who were quietly trained, somewhere along the way, to equate goodness with accommodation? Why can silence sometimes communicate agreement, even when you never meant it to? Even when inside your head, you were screaming the opposite? Why do healthy boundaries so often create short-term tension before they create long-term clarity? And why does that tension convince so many people to retreat, right when they were closest to something better? And maybe the most important question of all, why does the entire equation start to shift the moment you stop asking yourself, how do I make them happy with me? And start asking instead, what behavior am I actually willing to accept? Every one of those questions is going to be answered before this ends. Not with slogans, not with a script for becoming cold or intimidating or hard to reach, with something closer to a working theory of how respect is actually built, and how, without ever intending to, so many kind, thoughtful, conscientious people accidentally teach the people around them not to expect very much from their word. This is not a story about becoming someone new. It's a story about a version of you that was always there, underneath the accommodating one, a version that is still kind, still generous, still someone people can lean on, but who no longer confuses being liked with being safe. Let's find that version. Let's clear something up immediately, because if this gets misunderstood, everything that follows gets misunderstood with it. Kindness is not the problem. It was never the problem. Some of the most respected people you will ever meet are also some of the warmest. People who remember your birthday, who show up when you're sick, who give without needing credit for it. Kindness, real kindness, tends to earn respect rather than erode it. The problem has a different name, and it only looks like kindness from a distance. It's called people pleasing, and the two are far less related than most of us were taught to believe. Here is the difference. Stated as simply as it can be stated, kindness is something you offer. People pleasing is something you perform out of fear. Kindness comes from abundance, from a genuine wish for someone else to be okay. People pleasing comes from scarcity, from a fear of what happens to you if someone else isn't okay with you. Kindness can say no when no is the honest answer. People pleasing cannot, because the goal was never really about the other person's well-being. The goal was managing your own anxiety about their potential disapproval. This is worth sitting with, because it's uncomfortable. Most people pleasers do not think of themselves as afraid. They think of themselves as considerate, easygoing, low maintenance, the person who doesn't cause problems, and on the surface, the behavior looks identical to genuine generosity. Someone asks for help, and both the kind person and the people pleaser say yes. From the outside, you cannot tell the difference. But internally, something entirely different is happening. The kind person, asked for a favor they can't or don't want to give, feels a small, ordinary friction, a brief moment of considering the request, and then answers honestly, whichever way that goes. The people pleaser, asked the same question, feels something closer to alarm, not because the favor is unreasonable, but because the possibility of disappointing someone has just entered the room, and their nervous system treats that possibility like a threat that needs to be neutralized immediately. Saying yes isn't a decision at that point, it's an escape. This is why people-pleasing so often produces resentment, while genuine kindness rarely does. When you give because you decided to give, the giving belongs to you, and even when it costs you something, it tends to leave you intact. When you give because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't, the giving was never really a choice. It was compliance dressed up as generosity, and compliance, given long enough, quietly curdles into resentment, usually resentment aimed at exactly the wrong target, because it's much easier to be secretly furious at people in general than to admit you never actually told anyone what you needed. There's a second difference worth naming, because it explains why people-pleasing so rarely produces the respect it's chasing. Kindness has an internal compass. It says yes when yes feels right, and no when no feels right, based on some internal read of the situation and the relationship. People-pleasing has no compass at all. It has one instruction, repeated endlessly: avoid disapproval. That means a people-pleaser's yes carries almost no information. It doesn't tell anyone what that person actually wants, thinks, or is willing to do. It only tells them what will keep the peace in this exact moment. And other people, even people with no ill intentions whatsoever, eventually notice, usually without consciously realizing it, that a yes, that means nothing is not worth very much, not because they're cruel. Because a yes that is guaranteed regardless of the request stops functioning as a real answer. It becomes background noise. And background noise doesn't get respected. It gets used. This is the part that tends to sting a little. People don't usually lose respect for the people-pleaser because they see through the fear. Most people never think about it that consequentially at all. They simply learn, through repetition, that this particular person's agreement is always available, and available things get treated differently than valuable things. Not out of malice. Out of ordinary human psychology, we don't tend to prize what costs us nothing to obtain, so the fix is not to become less kind. It's to let your yes mean something again, which requires that your no be a real possibility too. A yes that could have been a no is worth infinitely more than a yes that was never actually optional. That single shift, more than any tactic or script, is where self-respect and other people's respect for you actually begin to realign. There's a quiet mix up that sits underneath almost everything in this audiobook, and it's worth pulling apart carefully, because the two things involved feel so similar that most people never separate them at all. Approval is what happens when someone likes your behavior in a given moment. Respect is what happens when someone trusts your character over time. They can travel together, but they are not the same currency, and you cannot buy one with the other. Although an enormous number of people spend years trying, approval is fast. It arrives the instant you say yes, the instant you agree, the instant you smooth something over instead of letting it stay uncomfortable. It feels wonderful because it resolves tension immediately. That immediacy is exactly what makes it so easy to chase and so unreliable to build anything on. Approval can be withdrawn in the same second it was given. It depends entirely on the other person's mood, needs, and expectations in that particular moment, none of which you control. Respect is slower, and it's built on a completely different material, predictability. Respect accumulates when someone can reliably guess how you'll behave, not because you're rigid, but because you're consistent with your own stated values. It's built less on whether people like each individual decision you make, and more on whether your decisions, taken as a pattern, tell them something true about who they're dealing with. Here's where it gets counterintuitive. Chasing approval over time actually works against respect. Every time you abandon a stated preference to keep someone comfortable, you may win a small moment of approval, but you also quietly teach that person your word is negotiable. That enough pressure or enough disappointment on their face will move you. And once someone learns that about you, respect becomes almost impossible, no matter how agreeable you continue to be, because respect requires believing that a person means what they say. You can be liked and not respected. You can also, and this is the part that surprises people, be respected by someone who is currently frustrated with you, even someone who currently doesn't approve of a specific decision you made. Think about people you already respect in your own life, not people you find pleasant. People you actually respect. Chances are, at least a few of them have disappointed you at some point, told you something you didn't want to hear, declined to help with something you wanted help with, held a position you disagreed with, calmly, without flinching, even while you pushed back, and chances are you still respect them, maybe even more. Because of it, because you learned something true about their word in that moment. You learned it meant something. Now think about the opposite kind of person, someone endlessly agreeable, who has never once told you no, who adjusts to whatever you want in every interaction. It's pleasant. It's also, if you're honest, a little hollow. You don't know what that person actually thinks, because you've never seen them hold a position against your preference. There's nothing solid to respect, because nothing solid has ever been shown to you. This reframes the entire project of being liked. Being liked is not dangerous in itself. The danger is in treating it as a substitute for respect and organizing your behavior, your yeses, your silences, your constant flexibility around securing it. Because approval, chased that way, doesn't just fail to produce respect. It actively erodes the conditions respect requires: consistency, honesty, and the willingness to occasionally be the person in the room who isn't thrilled about something. None of this means you should go looking for disapproval or treat disagreement as a badge of honor. That's just the same trap wearing a different costume. Performing friction instead of performing agreement, both in service of an image rather than the truth. The actual goal is simpler and less dramatic than either extreme. Say what's true for you. Let people respond however they respond, and stop keeping score on whether they liked it. Here's an idea that sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet it may be the single most useful psychological tool in this entire audiobook. You do not control how other people behave. That part is true, and it's worth remembering whenever this conversation starts to feel like it's about manipulation, because it isn't. You cannot make anyone respect you, apologize to you, or treat you the way you'd prefer to be treated. That was never on the table. But your repeated responses teach people what interacting with you tends to produce. Not through any conscious lesson plan on your part, just through the basic, unglamorous mechanics of behavior and consequence that operate in every relationship, whether anyone intends them to or not. If every request you receive gets a yes, regardless of your actual capacity or desire, people learn, quickly, and usually without noticing they've learned it, that requests to you produce yeses, not because they're calculating or unkind, because that's simply the pattern they've observed. Why would anyone expect anything different from you than what you have consistently shown them? If a boundary gets stated and then abandoned the moment someone pushes back or looks upset, people learn something equally clear. Your boundaries are opening offers, not actual limits. Not maliciously. Most people don't even register they've learned this consciously. They just notice that pushing, or waiting, or expressing disappointment tends to work on you. And once something works, people, being people, tend to keep doing it. This isn't a character flaw unique to the people around you. It's how basically all of us respond to reinforcement, including you, including me. If disrespect is met with the same warmth and access every time, with no shift whatsoever in your behavior, there is very little reason for that behavior to change, not because the other person is calculating how far they can push you. Usually there's no calculation at all. It's simpler and more mundane than that. Nothing has happened to suggest a change is necessary. And on the other side of this, if you consistently communicate calmly, mean what you say, and follow through on it, even in small, unglamorous ways, people learn that too. They learn that your yes is a real yes, which means it's worth something. They learn that your no is a real no, which means they don't need to test it repeatedly to find out if you're serious. The relationship becomes clearer, and clearer relationships, almost universally, are more respected relationships, even when they're not always the most comfortable ones in the moment. The key idea, worth writing down. If you're the type who writes things down, you don't teach people your boundaries by announcing them once, in a single dramatic conversation, and then expecting the message to hold forever. You teach them through consistency, applied over time, across small ordinary moments that nobody else is even tracking as carefully as you are. This reframes a lot of frustration that otherwise gets aimed at other people. If someone keeps crossing a line you've mentioned before, the tempting story is that they're selfish, or that they don't respect you, or that they're doing it on purpose. Sometimes that's true. But often, the more useful question is quieter. What has my behavior actually taught this person to expect? If the boundary was stated once, and then quietly absorbed the next 5 times it was crossed, the honest answer is that the boundary was never really established. It was suggested, and suggestions, unlike patterns, don't tend to change behavior. This isn't about blaming yourself for other people's choices. That would just be self-abandonment wearing a new outfit. It's about recognizing the one lever that was always actually in your hands, not their behavior, but your own consistency in response to it. That's the lever this entire audiobook keeps returning to, because it's the only one that was ever really yours to pull. 2. There's a cycle worth naming precisely, because once you can see its shape, you start noticing it running in the background of your own life, sometimes several times a day. It starts small. Someone asks for something, help, time, attention, a favor, an exception. You feel a flicker of discomfort, because some part of you already knows the honest answer might be no. That discomfort is uncomfortable enough that you want it gone as quickly as possible. So you say yes, and the discomfort disappears almost instantly, replaced by relief. The other person is happy. You feel, for a moment, good, competent, generous, likable. Later, sometimes hours later, sometimes days, a different feeling shows up, resentment. Quiet, usually not directed at anyone in particular. More like a low hum underneath your day. You don't examine it too closely, because examining it would mean admitting you didn't actually want to say yes. And that feels like it would make you a worse person than the one who cheerfully agreed. So you let the resentment sit there, unaddressed. Then the same person, or someone very similar, asks again, and you say yes again. Here's the part of this loop that most people miss entirely, because it runs counter to how we like to think about our own motivations. The reward driving this cycle is very rarely the other person's happiness, even though that's the story we tell ourselves. The actual reward is there's relief, the fast, reliable relief of no longer having to sit with the discomfort of possibly disappointing someone. Saying yes doesn't just make them happy. It makes the uncomfortable feeling in your own chest go away, right now, immediately. And your nervous system, like anyone's, is very good at learning which behaviors make discomfort disappear quickly. It will keep reaching for that behavior long after your conscious mind has decided it's not serving you anymore. This is worth sitting with, because it changes what the actual problem is. The problem was never, I care too much about people. The problem is that saying yes has become the fastest available way to regulate a specific kind of anxiety, the anxiety of imagining someone else's disappointment. And because that relief is so immediate and so reliable, it gets reinforced constantly, thousands of small repetitions over the years, until it stops feeling like a choice at all and starts feeling like a fixed part of your personality. I'm just someone who says yes. You're not. You're someone who has practiced saying yes as a way of managing an uncomfortable feeling for long enough that it now feels automatic. Those are different things, and the difference matters, because automatic patterns can be interrupted once you can see them clearly. Breaking this loop doesn't require becoming someone who enjoys disappointing people. Nobody actually needs to get there, and most people never do. It requires learning to tolerate the initial discomfort long enough to answer honestly instead of reflexively. That's it. Not confidence, not toughness. Just enough tolerance for a few uncomfortable seconds that the honest answer has time to surface before the automatic one does. One small, practical shift helps more than almost anything else here. Build in a pause. Not forever, just long enough to separate the request from the automatic reflex to relieve your own discomfort. Let me check and get back to you. I need to think about that. Can I let you know tomorrow? These aren't stalling tactics. They're a way of interrupting a pattern that has been running on autopilot long enough for your actual preference to catch up with your mouth. Let's slow down and look at a few ordinary situations, because the pattern we've been describing is easiest to recognize inside specific, familiar moments rather than abstract principles. A coworker asks you, again, to cover part of their workload. The first time, it seemed like a reasonable, one-off favor. By the fourth or fifth time, it has quietly become an arrangement, one you never actually agreed to, but one that exists anyway, because you kept saying yes and they kept asking. Notice they are not necessarily a bad person for asking. They're responding, reasonably, to a pattern that has worked every time they've tried it. The frustration you feel is real, but it isn't really about them. It's about a boundary that was never actually stated out loud. A friend only reaches out when they need something. You notice this quietly over months. And here's the uncomfortable part. You've never said anything about it, because saying something feels like it would sound petty or needy, or like you're keeping score in a friendship, which feels beneath you. So instead you keep showing up, fully available every time, while a small resentment accumulates that this person likely has no idea exists, because you've given them no information about it. A family member criticizes a decision you've already made. Your job, your relationship, your parenting, your choices. Not once, but as a recurring theme at every gathering. You've absorbed it for years because confronting a family member feels like it threatens something larger than the individual comment, the whole relationship, maybe the whole family's peace. So you smile, change the subject, and drive home, replaying the comment for the rest of the night. A partner crosses a boundary you've already explained clearly, interrupting you constantly, making a decision that affects you both without consulting you, being dismissive when you bring up something that matters to you. You've mentioned it before. Nothing changed. You mention it again, more gently this time, because you don't want to seem difficult. Someone speaks to you in a tone that would be unacceptable if you said it to them, and when you push back, even mildly, they respond by calling you sensitive or dramatic or difficult. And because that label stings, and because some part of you is terrified of actually being those things, you back down and apologize, even though you were the one who was spoken to badly in the first place. A manager keeps adding responsibilities to your role without acknowledging the added workload, let alone compensating for it. Each individual addition seems small enough to absorb. Taken together, They've quietly doubled what you're expected to do. And nobody above you has any incentive to notice, because you haven't said anything. And the work is still getting done. None of these scenes require a confrontation with fireworks. What they require, in every case, is the same small, unglamorous act. Naming the pattern out loud once, clearly, without excessive apology or justification. And then, this is the part that actually matters, being willing to follow through if the pattern continues anyway. That's the whole mechanism. Not intimidation, not ultimatums, just information, stated plainly, backed by consistent behavior. It sounds almost too small to matter. It is, in practice, the entire foundation of how respect gets rebuilt. Let's talk about the word itself, because for a lot of people, no has been quietly recast, somewhere over the years, as an aggressive word, something you deploy only when you're prepared for a fight. It isn't. At its healthiest, no is not a power move. It's information. A healthy no simply communicates, that doesn't work for me, nothing more is required. Not a tribunal, not a defense, not a performance of regret designed to soften the blow so thoroughly that the other person barely notices you declined at all. Consider a few examples of what calm refusal actually sounds like out loud, in real conversations. I can't do that. I won't be able to. That doesn't work for me. I've decided not to. I understand you're disappointed, but my answer is still no. I can help with this part, but not that part. Notice what's missing from every one of these. No extended essay defending the decision. No invented excuse constructed to make the no more palatable than the truth would be. No hostility, no sharp edge, no need to make the other person feel bad for asking. And also, this matters just as much, no apology for simply existing, for simply having a limit, for simply being a person with needs that occasionally conflict with someone else's request. There's a reason so many people instinctively reach for an excuse instead of an honest no. An excuse feels safer because it implies the refusal isn't really about you. It's about some external circumstance beyond your control. I would, but I have plans. I would, but I'm swamped this week. The trouble is that excuses are fragile. They can be argued with, worked around, disproven. I have plans, invites, can't you move them? And once you're negotiating the excuse, you've lost the actual point, which was never about your schedule. It was about your preference. A plain no, without an attached excuse, is far harder to argue with, precisely because there's nothing to argue against. That doesn't work for me isn't a claim about external circumstances that can be debated. It's a statement about your own decision, and decisions, stated plainly, don't require external justification to be valid. This is worth repeating, because it runs against a lot of quiet conditioning. You do not need a good enough reason to say no. You do not need the other person's agreement that your reason is sufficient. A boundary that requires unanimous approval before it's allowed to exist was never really a boundary. It was a request for permission, wearing a boundaries clothing. None of this is a script for becoming unhelpful or unavailable as a general policy. Most people, most of the time, are going to keep saying yes to most things because most requests are genuinely fine and most relationships are genuinely worth the small costs of generosity. The goal isn't to ration your yeses out of suspicion. It's to make sure that when the honest answer really is no, you have access to saying it. Calmly, plainly, without a 5-minute trial defending your right to have said it at all. There's a specific habit worth examining closely, because almost everyone who struggles with boundaries does it, usually without noticing, over-explaining. It's the 5-minute justification for a decision that could have been stated in 5 seconds. It's the extra reasons, piled one on top of another, offered up before anyone even asked for them. It's the nervous, rapid speech that fills the silence right after you've said no, because the silence itself feels unbearable. Here's the psychological trap hiding inside it. The more reasons you give for a boundary, the more surface area you've created for someone to argue with. Every additional justification is, whether you intend it this way or not, an additional thing that can be picked apart, questioned, or countered. Offer one reason, and someone can dismantle that reason. Offer 5, and you've simply given them 5 separate doors to walk through, 5 separate places to keep the negotiation alive. This is different from healthy, honest communication, and it's worth being precise about the difference. Explaining your reasoning, when it's useful to the other person and offered without anxiety, is a normal, healthy part of relationships. I can't help this weekend because I've committed to something else that matters to me, is a complete, honest sentence. The over-explaining version sounds different. It has a pleading undertone, a slight breathlessness, an unspoken request buried inside it. Please don't be upset with me for this. That undertone is the tell. It reveals that the explanation isn't really informational. It's an attempt to purchase the other person's approval of your boundary before you're willing to let yourself have it. Here is the deeper lesson worth carrying forward. A boundary does not require unanimous approval to be legitimate. You do not need to convince someone that your limit is philosophically justified, morally sound, and beyond reasonable dispute before you're allowed to hold it. It is enough that it is genuinely yours. This doesn't mean context is never appropriate. Sometimes a brief explanation is simply considerate, and there's nothing wrong with offering one. The distinction is in the motive and the length. A single sentence of honest context, offered once, calmly fine, often even kind. A defense that keeps expanding every time the other person pushes back, growing new justifications like a hydra growing new heads. That's not communication anymore. That's negotiation from a position that has already conceded the boundary is up for debate. The practical version of this lesson is almost embarrassingly simple. Say what you need to say, offer a brief reason if it feels natural, and then stop talking. Let the silence that follows exist without rushing to fill it. It will feel uncomfortable the first several times. That discomfort is not a sign you did something wrong. It's simply what it feels like to hold a position without defending it. A feeling most people pleasers have very little practice tolerating, and one that gets easier, reliably, the more you let yourself sit inside it. Let's go somewhere more honest for a moment, because most of what we've covered so far has been mechanical. Patterns, principles, cause and effect. Underneath the mechanics, there's usually something more tender. Many people do not actually fear the word no. They can say it, technically, if pressed. What they fear is everything that might come after it. They fear someone becoming visibly disappointed in them. They fear someone becoming angry, even briefly. They fear being privately thought of as selfish, difficult, cold, ungrateful. They fear someone withdrawing warmth or affection, even slightly, even temporarily. They fear being called difficult in a tone that suggests it's a permanent character flaw, rather than a single decision. They fear hearing the words, spoken quietly or not so quietly, "You've changed." If you recognize any of this, it's worth pausing here, because there's a reframe that matters more than almost anything else in this audiobook. Maybe you have changed. Maybe you've become more honest. Maybe you've stopped volunteering for things you secretly resent. Maybe you've stopped confusing guilt with actual responsibility. Two feelings that are frequently mistaken for each other, but which point in entirely different directions. Maybe you've simply stopped making your emotional comfort permanently dependent on everyone around you approving of every choice you make. None of that is a loss. It might look like one, from the outside, to people who benefited from the previous arrangement, but a change that moves you toward honesty is not evidence that something has gone wrong. Often it's the opposite, evidence that something that was quietly wrong for a long time is finally being corrected. Here is the sentence worth carrying forward from this section, because it undoes a huge amount of unnecessary suffering. Once it actually lands, someone being disappointed in you does not automatically mean you did something wrong. Disappointment is an emotional reaction, and emotional reactions are not verdicts. A person can be completely disappointed by a decision that was completely reasonable. A child is disappointed when told they can't have candy for dinner. That disappointment doesn't mean the parent made a bad call. An employee might be disappointed when a raise doesn't happen this quarter. That disappointment doesn't automatically mean the decision was unfair. A friend might be disappointed when you decline to lend money you can't comfortably spare. Their disappointment tells you about their feelings. It does not, on its own, tell you anything about whether your decision was correct. This is where a huge amount of chronic accommodation actually originates. Not from a rational calculation that saying yes is usually the right call, but from an emotional equation where someone else's disappointment gets treated as unbearable, as something that must be prevented at nearly any cost, including the cost of your own priorities, time, and self-respect. Once disappointment becomes something you can tolerate, rather than something you must eliminate on sight, an enormous amount of chronic yes saying simply stops being necessary. None of this means becoming indifferent to other people's feelings. That would be its own kind of imbalance, trading self-abandonment for a different kind of disconnection. It means holding two things at once: genuine care for how someone feels, and the recognition that their feelings, however real, don't automatically override your own reasonable limits. Let's address something directly, because a title like this one can be misread if it's left to speak for itself. This is not an argument for intimidation. It is not an argument for becoming cold, unreadable, or difficult to reach. It is not an argument for threatening consequences you have no intention of following through on, or for treating every interaction as a contest to be won. Fear can produce compliance. It's an old, blunt tool, and it works, in the narrow sense that people who are afraid of you will often do what you want. But compliance produced by fear is brittle. It exists only as long as the fear does. It corrodes the relationship underneath it, and it tends to collapse, sometimes suddenly, sometimes with real damage, the moment the feared person's power or presence is removed. Fear-based compliance was never respect. It was just a temporary, unstable substitute that happened to look similar from a distance. Real respect is built from entirely different material. It's built from reliability, doing what you said you'd do, consistently, even when it's inconvenient, from competence, being genuinely good at what you do, in ways people can observe over time, from integrity, behaving the same way whether or not anyone is watching, from self-control, the ability to stay steady in situations that would rattle someone less grounded, from clear communication, saying what you mean, in language people don't have to decode, from boundaries, showing people, through consistent behavior, what you will and won't accept, from keeping your word, even about small things nobody else would notice if you didn't, from treating other people with basic dignity, even the ones you're currently in conflict with, from being willing to disagree, openly and calmly, rather than performing agreement you don't feel, from taking responsibility when you're actually wrong, without collapsing into excessive self-punishment, from standing by decisions you've made after reasonable thought, even when someone pushes back on them. None of these require volume. None of them require dominance. None of them require anyone to feel small in your presence. If anything, the opposite tends to be true. People who rely on intimidation are usually compensating for the absence of these other, slower, to build qualities. Real respect doesn't need to announce itself, because it's demonstrated, repeatedly, in ordinary moments that accumulate into a track record. This distinction matters enormously for how you interpret the rest of this audiobook. When we talk about boundaries, we are not talking about leverage. When we talk about consequences, we are not talking about punishment. When we talk about disappointing someone, we are not talking about making them suffer for having wanted something from you. Every one of these ideas is meant to operate inside a framework of basic decency toward other people, including the people whose behavior you're finally deciding not to accommodate anymore. You can hold a firm boundary and still wish the other person well. You can decline a request and still care about the person making it. You can walk away from a repeatedly disrespectful situation without needing to make the other person feel humiliated on your way out. That combination, firmness without cruelty, is not a contradiction. It's the entire target this audiobook has been aiming at from the beginning. There's a moment almost everyone who begins setting boundaries eventually encounters, and it's worth preparing for in advance, because it catches most people off guard. You start behaving a little differently, saying no more honestly, pausing before agreeing to things, speaking up about something that bothered you instead of absorbing it silently. And someone in your life notices, not always with hostility, sometimes with genuine confusion, but the questions tend to sound something like this. What's gotten into you? You used to be so much easier to deal with. Why are you being difficult all of a sudden? You've changed. It's tempting, in that moment, to treat the comment as proof that you've done something wrong, to read the discomfort on someone else's face as a verdict on your new behavior, and quietly retreat back to the old pattern to make the discomfort go away. Resist that instinct long enough to actually examine what's happening. Sometimes, people react to a new boundary simply because the boundary changes an arrangement that quietly benefited them. If someone has grown used to you always being available, always saying yes, always absorbing the emotional cost of keeping the peace, then a new boundary genuinely does cost them something. Not because you're being unreasonable, but because the previous arrangement, whether they realized it consciously or not, worked in their favor. Their discomfort with your change doesn't necessarily mean your change is wrong. It might just mean the old dynamic is ending, and endings are rarely comfortable for the side that was benefiting. But, and this matters just as much, that explanation isn't automatically true every single time, and it would be its own kind of self-deception to assume it always is. Not every criticism you receive after setting a boundary is manipulation in disguise. Sometimes people push back because you genuinely did overcorrect, or because the boundary you set wasn't really about protecting something important, but about punishing someone for an old grievance you never actually addressed directly. The mature move here isn't to assume either explanation automatically. It's to ask yourself a specific, honest question every time this comes up. Is this boundary protecting something that actually matters to me, or am I using it to get back at someone? Those two things can look identical from the outside. Both involve saying no. Both involve someone else feeling disappointed. But they come from completely different places, and they tend to produce completely different long-term outcomes. A boundary built to protect something real tends to create clarity and, eventually, a steadier relationship. A boundary built to punish tends to create an escalating cycle that rarely resolves anything. This kind of self-checking isn't a weakness or a step backward into old people-pleasing habits. It's what keeps assertiveness from curdling into something less healthy. The goal was never to become someone who is reflexively suspicious of every pushback, treating all resistance as proof of someone else's bad character. The goal is to become someone capable of holding a boundary steadily, while still being willing to examine, honestly, whether that boundary is doing what you meant for it to do. There's a confusion that trips up a lot of people right around the point where they start taking this whole idea seriously, and it's worth untangling before it causes real damage. The difference between a boundary and a wall. A wall says, nobody gets close. It's a blanket policy, applied indiscriminately, built to prevent any possibility of being hurt again. A wall doesn't ask who's approaching or why. It just keeps everyone out. The people who might have hurt you, and the people who never would have, all treated the same, all held at the same permanent distance. A boundary says something entirely different. You can be close. But this specific behavior isn't acceptable. It's selective. It's precise. It draws a line around a particular action or pattern, not around your entire capacity for connection. A wall isolates. A boundary clarifies. That distinction is worth sitting with because it's easy, especially after being hurt or repeatedly disrespected, to overcorrect from having no limits at all straight into having no openness at all, swapping one imbalance for its opposite, mistaking the second for healing, when it's really just a different flavor of self-protection that ends up costing you the same thing the first one did: real relationships. A wall is usually built from fear, a generalized expectation that closeness itself is dangerous, that the safest posture is simply to keep everyone at arm's length before they get the chance to disappoint you. A boundary, at its healthiest, is built from something closer to self-respect, a specific understanding of which behaviors you will and won't accept, paired with an ongoing willingness to actually let people in, provided they treat you reasonably once they're there. The practical test is worth keeping somewhere easy to remember. Does this limit apply to a specific behavior, or does it apply to closeness itself? If a friend once betrayed a confidence, and you've decided not to share certain sensitive things with them anymore, that's a boundary. Precise, behavior-specific, still leaving room for the friendship to continue in a modified form. If, instead, you've quietly decided never to be vulnerable with anyone again, because one person mishandled your trust, that's a wall, and it will protect you from being hurt in exactly the way it will also guarantee you stay lonely. The goal underneath everything in this audiobook was never to trust nobody. It was to become capable of trusting selectively, extending real openness to people who have shown, through their actual behavior over time, that they can be trusted with it, while declining to extend that same openness automatically to everyone, regardless of how they've treated you. That's a much harder skill than either blanket trust or blanket suspicion, because it requires ongoing judgment rather than a single fixed policy. But it's the only version of this that actually lets you keep both things that matter: your safety and your capacity for genuine connection. We're roughly at the halfway point of this audiobook, which is a good place to say plainly, the idea that everything before this has been circling around, and everything after this is going to build on directly. The real opposite of people pleasing is not selfishness. It's self-respect. That distinction matters more than almost anything else here, because it removes the false choice that keeps so many people stuck. The false choice sounds like this: either I keep abandoning myself to keep everyone comfortable, or I become the kind of person who only thinks about themselves. Neither of those is actually where this is heading, and framing it as a binary between the two is exactly what keeps people frozen in the first option, because becoming selfish, cold, or indifferent to others feels like too high a price to pay for a little more peace. But self-respect isn't selfishness. Selfishness disregards other people's needs. Self-respect simply refuses to disregard your own. You can hold both: genuine care for the people in your life, and a genuine unwillingness to abandon yourself in the process of caring for them. Those two things were never actually in competition. They only feel that way to someone who has spent years treating their own needs as the one variable that's always allowed to be sacrificed first. You don't have to become less caring to fix this. You have to stop using care as a justification for abandoning yourself. That's the whole shift. Not less warmth, not less generosity, just generosity that includes you as one of the people it's extended to, rather than the one person permanently excluded from it. Here, finally, is what the title of this audiobook actually means, once you strip away the provocation it was built with. Stop being nice doesn't mean stop being kind, stop being generous, stop being considerate of other people's feelings. It means stop performing kindness when what you're actually feeling, underneath it, is fear. Stop calling it kindness when it's really compliance. Stop calling it patience when it's really an inability to tolerate someone's disapproval. Stop calling it generosity when it's really an attempt to earn safety you were never actually going to lose in the first place. The behaviors that need to stop were never really kindness at all. They were self-abandonment, wearing kindness as a disguise convincing enough to fool even the person doing it. Everything from here forward is about what replaces that, not coldness, not indifference, not a hardened version of you built to prove a point to people who hurt you. Something steadier than that. Something that can still give freely, still show up for people, still be moved by someone else's need, but that no longer confuses giving with disappearing. There's a quieter cost to chronic accommodation that rarely gets discussed, because it doesn't show up in any single dramatic moment. It builds slowly, through repetition, in a place most people don't think to look your relationship with yourself. Every time you override a reasonable boundary to secure someone else's approval, you're not just making a decision about that specific moment, you're also teaching yourself something. The same way, a chapter ago, we talked about how your behavior teaches other people what to expect from you. It turns out you're doing the same thing to yourself, constantly, whether you notice it or not. You teach yourself, my needs come second, automatically, without needing to be weighed against anything else. You teach yourself, my word doesn't actually hold much weight, even to me. You teach yourself, I cannot tolerate someone being disappointed in me, so if it comes down to that or abandoning my own decision, I'll abandon the decision. You teach yourself enough pressure, applied by someone else, will always move me, no matter what I said I wanted. And none of these lessons get delivered in a single sentence. They accumulate, the same way any pattern accumulates, through hundreds of small moments where the same choice gets made, until the choice no longer feels like a choice at all, and the result, over enough time, is a specific and painful kind of damage. You stop trusting yourself, not in some abstract, philosophical way, concretely. You stop trusting that you'll actually follow through on your own decisions, which makes it harder to make decisions at all, because some part of you already suspects you won't hold the line even if you do. This is worth naming clearly, because it explains a frustration a lot of people carry without being able to locate its source. The sense of not really knowing what you want anymore, of feeling strangely disconnected from your own preferences. That disconnection often isn't a mystery. It's the predictable result of years spent overriding your own read of a situation in favor of whatever would keep someone else comfortable. You didn't lose access to your preferences. You trained yourself, through repetition, to distrust them. The good news is that this process runs in both directions, and it can be reversed with the same mechanism that built it: repetition, not intensity. You don't rebuild self-trust with one dramatic act of defiance. You rebuild it the same unglamorous way you rebuild trust with anyone else, through small, kept promises, repeated consistently. Make a small commitment to yourself and keep it, even when it's inconvenient. Say no when you actually mean no, even in a low-stakes situation where nobody would notice if you caved. Speak up about something small that matters to you, even if it would have been easier to let it pass. Leave a situation that keeps repeating a pattern you've already said you won't tolerate. Follow through calmly on something you told yourself you'd do. None of these have to be dramatic. In fact, they work better when they're not. Small, low stakes. Repeated evidence tends to rebuild trust faster than a single high-stakes gesture, the same way it does in any other relationship. And the result of this rebuilding isn't only that other people start responding to you differently, although they usually do. It's that you begin trusting yourself differently, which turns out to be the foundation everything else in this audiobook has actually been standing on the entire time. Resentment rarely announces itself honestly. It tends to arrive sideways, disguised as irritability, exhaustion, a short temper over something unrelated, a vague sense that you're being taken for granted without being able to point to exactly when that started. It's worth tracing it back to its actual source, because the source is usually more specific and more fixable than it feels in the moment. Here's the pattern, and it's remarkably consistent across very different relationships. You say yes to something, not dishonestly. In the moment, you may genuinely believe you're offering it freely. The other person, reasonably, assumes exactly what your yes suggested, that you wanted to help, that this was a real, uncomplicated gift. Meanwhile, some quieter part of you is secretly expecting them to notice how much this is actually costing you. The time, the energy, the things you're privately giving up to make this happen. You're waiting for acknowledgement you never actually asked for. They don't notice. Of course they don't. You never told them there was anything to notice. From their perspective, nothing unusual happened. You offered. They accepted. The transaction was complete and equal on both sides. And so slowly, resentment builds. Not because they did anything wrong, because an unspoken agreement existed only in your head, and unspoken agreements, by definition, cannot be honored by anyone who was never told the terms. This creates a specific, painful cycle worth naming: precisely unspoken sacrifice, followed by an unmet expectation nobody knew existed, followed by resentment, aimed at someone who genuinely had no way of knowing they'd disappointed you, because you never gave them the information required to do otherwise. The tempting fix here is to become less generous, to give less, help less, offer less, on the theory that this will prevent the resentment from building in the first place. But that misdiagnoses the problem. The issue was never the generosity itself. It was the gap between what you actually felt and what you communicated. The solution isn't less giving, it's more honest giving. If you say yes, let it be a real yes, something you're actually offering freely, without a silent invoice attached that the other person was never shown. If it isn't a real yes, if some part of you is already resentful before you've even finished agreeing, that's useful information. And it's worth listening to before you speak, not after you've already committed and started quietly keeping score. This becomes one of the more practical shifts available to anyone working through this material. Before agreeing to something, pause long enough to check whether you're offering it freely or offering it out of fear, obligation, or a hope that it will be noticed and repaid later. If it's the second one, that's not a moral failing, it's just useful data, telling you that either the request needs a different answer, or that the terms need to be made explicit rather than left as a silent expectation. Either way, the resentment that would have built quietly in the background gets addressed at the source, instead of accumulating for months before finally erupting over something unrelated and much smaller. There's a particular kind of strength that gets overlooked constantly, mostly because it doesn't look like strength in the way we've been culturally trained to recognize it. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't require anyone else to lose for it to register as a win. It's the power of calm, unemotional clarity, and it tends to be far more credible over time than anything louder. A boundary becomes more believable, not less, when it doesn't require emotional escalation to be taken seriously. Shouting, dramatic ultimatums, visible anger, these can occasionally produce short-term compliance, but they also signal something underneath them, a kind of desperation, a sense that the boundary needs force behind it, because it might not hold on its own. Calm boundaries send the opposite signal. They suggest a person who is entirely sure of their own position and doesn't need anyone else's agreement to hold it. You don't have to become louder to be taken seriously. You don't have to win the conversation. You don't have to prove in the moment that you're right and the other person is wrong. Sometimes the most powerful sentence available in a given moment is also the simplest one: no, that doesn't work for me. And then silence. That silence is doing more work than it might seem to be doing. It resists the urge to immediately soften what you just said, to backfill it with justification, to rescue the other person from the discomfort of hearing a plain no. Let them react however they react. You do not have to manage their reaction on their behalf. You do not have to immediately fix whatever discomfort your honesty just introduced into the room. This is one of the harder skills in this entire audiobook, because it goes against a very old, very deep instinct in a lot of people, the instinct to smooth things over the instant any tension appears. Sitting inside a moment of tension without rushing to dissolve it feels, at first, almost unbearable. It gets easier with repetition, the same way everything else in this material gets easier with repetition. What starts out feeling like you're doing something wrong gradually starts feeling like simple honesty, delivered without unnecessary decoration. Quiet power isn't about withholding warmth. You can say the plain sentence and still say it kindly, still make eye contact, still care about the person you're saying it to. What quiet power withholds is something different: the performance, the extra words, the apology for having a limit at all. What's left, once those are stripped away, tends to land with far more weight than anything louder ever could. It helps, at this point, to have something concrete to reach for in the actual moment, not a philosophy, but a sequence of steps small enough to actually use when you're standing in the middle of an uncomfortable interaction and your instincts are pulling you toward the old pattern. The first step is simply to notice what actually happened, in plain terms, stripped of interpretation. Someone made a comment, interrupted you, made a decision without you, spoke in a tone that didn't sit right. Before anything else, just name the event itself, clearly, the way you describe it to someone who wasn't there. The second step is to separate fact from interpretation. This is a subtler skill than it sounds. Did they actually disagree with you, or did they disrespect you? Those are not the same thing, even though they can feel identical in the heat of a moment. Someone telling you they think you're wrong about something is disagreement. Uncomfortable, maybe, but not disrespect. Someone dismissing you, mocking you, or talking over you repeatedly is a different category entirely. Confusing the two in either direction causes problems. Treating ordinary disagreement as disrespect creates unnecessary conflict, while treating actual disrespect as mere disagreement lets a real pattern continue unaddressed. The third step is to decide whether it actually matters enough to address. Not everything does. Not every irritation, every offhand comment, every minor friction requires a conversation. Some things are genuinely small enough to let pass without any cost to your self-respect. This step matters because addressing everything, indiscriminately, isn't strength. It's a different kind of imbalance, one that treats every interaction as a battlefield and exhausts both you and everyone around you in the process. The fourth step, when something does matter, is to state the boundary clearly. No extended preamble. No excessive softening, no performance, just the plain sentence, said once. I don't appreciate being spoken to that way. I need you to check with me before making that decision. That comment isn't okay with me. The fifth step is to watch the response without needing to control it. Does the other person adjust, even slightly? Do they acknowledge what you said, or does the same behavior continue as though nothing happened? This information matters because it tells you what kind of relationship you're actually in. One where a stated boundary gets respected, or one where it gets tested. The sixth step, and often the hardest one, is to follow through if the behavior continues despite the boundary being stated. This doesn't require drama. It might mean declining to engage further in that specific conversation. It might mean limiting your availability to that person going forward. It might mean, in more serious or repeated cases, stepping back from the relationship altogether. Whatever the follow-through looks like, the essential thing is that it actually happens. Because a boundary that's stated but never enforced teaches exactly the opposite lesson from the one you intended. The seventh and final step is to move on. Don't spend the next several hours replaying the interaction, rehearsing better comebacks, trying to prove retroactively that you were right. You said what needed to be said. What the other person does with it belongs to them now, not to you. 7 steps, none of them dramatic, all of them repeatable. This sequence is the practical backbone underneath everything more abstract this audiobook has covered so far. It's worth pausing on something that could easily be misread from everything covered so far. The idea that healthy boundaries mean confronting every single instance of friction, every minor irritation, every small thing that doesn't sit quite right. That isn't the goal, and pursuing it would replace one imbalance with another, equally exhausting one. Respect includes knowing when to engage and when to let something go. A person who reacts to every minor slight, every offhand comment, every small inconvenience, is not necessarily demonstrating strength. Often they're demonstrating something closer to hypervigilance. A nervous system so primed to detect disrespect that it starts finding it everywhere, including in places it was never actually present. Sometimes strength looks exactly like restraint. This isn't worth my attention. A stranger's rudeness in traffic. A friend's offhand comment made in a bad mood that doesn't reflect a real pattern. A single instance of something that would only matter if it became a habit. Letting these pass isn't people-pleasing. It's a reasonable allocation of energy, choosing not to spend your limited attention on things that don't actually threaten anything important. Other times, strength looks like the opposite. This matters enough that I need to address it. See a recurring pattern, a comment that crossed a real line, a decision that affects you significantly and was made without your input. These deserve the energy that the smaller things don't. The skill worth developing here isn't a fixed rule that applies identically to every situation. Always speak up, or usually let it go. It's judgment, exercised case by case, informed by a few honest questions. Is this a pattern or an isolated moment? Does this actually affect something that matters to me, or is it just mildly unpleasant? Am I about to address this because it's genuinely important, or because I'm currently activated and looking for somewhere to direct that energy? This kind of discernment takes practice, and it won't always land perfectly. Sometimes you'll let something go that, in retrospect, deserved to be addressed. Sometimes you'll address something that, in retrospect, wasn't worth the energy. Neither of those outcomes is catastrophic. They're just data, feeding into better judgment the next time a similar situation comes up. What matters most is that the choice to engage or to let something go is actually a choice, made consciously, based on what the situation calls for, rather than a default setting running automatically in the background. Whether that default is confront everything or confront nothing, both defaults run without judgment, tend to cause their own kind of damage over time. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to make everyone in your life fully understand and agree with every boundary you set. Explaining, re-explaining, finding the exact combination of words that will finally make someone see it your way and stop being upset about it. Here's the uncomfortable truth worth sitting with. Sometimes you can explain yourself as clearly and as fairly as it's possible to explain something, and the other person will still disagree. Not because your explanation was inadequate, because they have their own perspective, their own interests, their own reasons for preferring things had gone differently, and no amount of additional clarity from you is going to override that. This is where a distinction worth borrowing from Stoic philosophy becomes genuinely useful, not as an abstract idea, but as something you can actually apply the next time this comes up. Your responsibility is clarity. Their reaction belongs to them. You are responsible for communicating honestly, calmly, and as clearly as you reasonably can. You are not responsible for guaranteeing that the other person receives that communication the way you'd prefer them to. With immediate understanding, warm agreement, and no residual disappointment. That reaction, whatever it turns out to be, is theirs to have. Trying to control it, through further explaining, through anxious reassurance, through backing away from your own position until they seem satisfied, puts you in charge of something that was never actually within your control to begin with. This reframe tends to relieve an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering, because so much of the exhaustion around boundary setting doesn't actually come from setting the boundary itself. It comes from the follow-up project of trying to manage everyone's feelings about it afterward, as though their acceptance were a requirement for the boundary to be valid. It isn't. You can be misunderstood and still be right to have set the limit. You can be disagreed with and still be behaving with complete integrity. You can leave someone disappointed and still have communicated with total honesty and respect. Being understood is pleasant when it happens. It was never actually the requirement. This doesn't mean giving up on being understood entirely or refusing to clarify when there's genuine confusion. It means recognizing the point where clarification has already been offered and where continuing to push for the other person's full agreement has stopped being about communication and started being about your own discomfort with their unresolved reaction. That point is worth learning to recognize, because it's usually the exact moment to stop talking and let the conversation rest, even if it doesn't rest the way you would have preferred. Two more distinctions are worth adding here, because they tend to hide inside situations that otherwise look like straightforward kindness. The first is the difference between helping and rescuing. Helping responds to a genuine need, offered because you have the capacity and the willingness to give it, without taking over something that actually belongs to someone else. Rescuing looks similar on the surface, but it operates from a different motive. Often an inability to tolerate watching someone else struggle, even when that struggle is a normal, necessary part of them solving their own problem. Helping a friend move apartments is helping. Consistently finishing a coworker's tasks because they seem overwhelmed week after week, without ever addressing why they're overwhelmed in the first place, starts to shade into rescuing. And rescuing, over time, tends to produce a strange result. It doesn't actually make things better. It removes the natural consequences that would otherwise prompt a change, while quietly training the other person to expect that someone else will always step in. Everyone involved ends up worse off than if the help had been offered more selectively, with an eye toward the other person's actual growth, rather than simply relieving your own discomfort at watching them struggle. This doesn't mean withholding help out of some cold theory about letting people learn. It means checking your motive honestly. Am I helping because this genuinely serves them, or because I can't tolerate watching them be uncomfortable, so I'm removing my own discomfort as much as theirs. The second distinction is between forgiveness and permission, and it's one of the more important ones in this entire audiobook, because the two get confused constantly. Forgiveness is something you do for your own sake. Releasing the grip that resentment has on you, choosing not to carry a grievance indefinitely, letting go of the desire for retribution. It's an internal process, and it can happen entirely independently of whether the other person ever apologizes, changes, or even acknowledges what happened. Permission is something else entirely. It's an ongoing invitation for the same behavior to continue, extended into the future. Forgiving someone for something they did last year does not obligate you to keep tolerating the same behavior this year. You can fully forgive a friend for breaking your trust once and still, reasonably, decide not to share sensitive information with them going forward. That isn't holding a grudge. That's simply having learned something true, through direct experience, about what that particular relationship can currently hold. A lot of chronic accommodation actually runs on this exact confusion. The belief that being a forgiving person requires giving someone unlimited additional chances, as though forgiveness and ongoing trust were the same transaction. They aren't. You can release the resentment completely and still adjust your behavior going forward based on what you've learned. Both things can be true at once, and understanding that they can is often what finally allows someone to let go of old resentment without feeling like doing so requires reopening themselves to the same harm indefinitely. Understanding an idea and living differently because of it are two separate projects, and the gap between them is closed through practice, not insight alone. Here are some of the small, repeatable moves worth building into ordinary life. Practice small no's first, in low-stakes situations, before you need the skill for something that actually matters. Decline the extra task at work that isn't urgent. Say no to a minor request from a friend where the cost of disappointing them is genuinely small. These low-stakes repetitions build the muscle for the moments that will actually count. Pause before agreeing to anything that isn't an immediate, obvious yes. "Let me think about it and get back to you," is a complete, reasonable sentence, and it interrupts the automatic reflex long enough for your honest answer to surface. Ask for time before making commitments, especially ones you can feel yourself wanting to agree to out of discomfort, rather than genuine desire. Time creates space between the request and the response, and that space is often where the honest answer lies. Remove automatic apologies from situations that don't actually call for one. Notice how often sorry appears before a perfectly reasonable request or statement. "Sorry, but could you?" "Sorry, I just think." Try removing it and notice that the sentence loses nothing except an unnecessary plea for permission. Speak directly instead of hinting. Hinting protects you from the vulnerability of a direct request, but it also makes it far more likely to be missed, misunderstood, or ignored, and then quietly resented when it doesn't produce the result you were hoping for. Express preferences plainly, even about small things: where to eat, what to watch, how to spend an afternoon. Constantly deferring on small decisions trains both you and the people around you to expect that you don't have preferences worth stating, which becomes a habit that's much harder to break once it's applied to bigger things. Disagree without hostility. It's possible to say, "I see it differently," without raising your voice, without personal attacks, without treating disagreement as a threat that needs to be neutralized immediately. Stop the unnecessary explanations once the point has already been made clearly. Notice the urge to keep talking after a boundary has been stated, and practice letting it go unfulfilled. Follow through on the boundaries that are actually reasonable, even when it's uncomfortable in the moment. This is where trust, both other people's trust in you and your own trust in yourself actually gets built. Allow someone to be disappointed without immediately trying to fix it. Let the disappointment exist as their experience, without treating it as an emergency requiring your intervention. Recognize guilt without automatically obeying it. Guilt is a feeling, not a verdict. It deserves attention, not automatic compliance. Separate genuine responsibility from imagined responsibility. The difference between things you actually caused and things you've simply absorbed the emotional weight of, out of habit. Protect time for the priorities that matter to you. Treating that time with the same seriousness you'd extend to a commitment made to someone else. Keep the promises you make to yourself with the same consistency you'd want to bring to a promise made to another person. Reduce access, gradually if needed, for people who repeatedly violate boundaries you've already stated clearly. Repair relationships sincerely when you were genuinely in the wrong. This material is not a license to avoid accountability, only a correction to the habit of accepting blame that was never actually yours. Apologize when an apology is warranted, without apologizing for simply having needs, preferences, or limits. Learn to distinguish discomfort from danger. The fact that something feels uncomfortable to say or do is not, by itself, evidence that it's wrong or harmful. Learn to distinguish criticism from disrespect. Someone offering a fair critique of your work or your choice is not the same as someone treating you with contempt, even though both can produce a similar sting in the moment. None of these are dramatic on their own. Together, practiced consistently over time, they add up to an entirely different way of moving through relationships. There's a realization that tends to arrive quietly, often much later than the rest of this material has already sunk in, and it's worth naming directly because it can be genuinely disorienting the first time it surfaces. Maybe you were never simply too nice. Maybe, underneath the niceness, you were trying to purchase safety with compliance. If I keep them happy, some part of you may have reasoned, without ever putting it in exactly these words, they won't reject me. If I never disagree, they won't become angry with me. If I always help, they'll finally see how valuable I am. If I never complain, they'll think of me as easy to love, easy to keep around, easy to choose. It's a bargain, and like most bargains made out of fear rather than genuine desire, it has a cost that isn't obvious at first. You get something real out of it. A measure of temporary approval, a reduced risk of conflict, the short-term relief of avoiding disappointment, but the price paid slowly in installments too small to notice individually is yourself, your preferences, quietly set aside so often that you stop being able to locate them, your honest reactions, filtered so consistently that even you start to lose track of what you actually think. Your energy, spent so thoroughly on managing everyone else's comfort that there's little left over for anything that was actually yours. This isn't a reason for self-blame. The bargain usually gets made early, often in childhood or adolescence, in situations where accommodation genuinely was the safest available strategy. Where a child, dependent and powerless in ways an adult isn't, learned that keeping the peace kept them safe, or loved, or out of trouble. That strategy made sense once. It may simply have outlived its usefulness, continuing to run on autopilot long after the original circumstances that required it are gone. Here's the reframe worth carrying forward from this realization: you don't need to become difficult in order to become respected. You don't need to overcorrect into someone hard, guarded, or combative to undo years of the opposite pattern. What's actually required is smaller and, in some ways, harder, becoming willing to remain yourself, consistently, even in the specific moments when someone else is disappointed by that, not performing disagreement to prove a point, not manufacturing conflict to demonstrate you've changed. Just staying present, honest, and steady, even when staying that way costs you a moment of someone else's approval. That's the entire shift this bargain requires you to make, and it's a quieter, slower process than most people expect, closer to a long series of small, repeated choices than a single dramatic transformation. Everything up to this point has largely examined how other people respond to you, how your patterns train their expectations, how your consistency builds or erodes their respect. It's worth turning that same lens inward now, because respect from others often has less to do with changing anyone else's behavior and more to do with the standards you consistently apply to your own. A few questions worth sitting with honestly, without rushing to answer them, the way you'd like to be able to answer them. What do you repeatedly tolerate in a given relationship or situation that you've never actually said out loud you're unhappy with? What promises to yourself do you repeatedly break? The earlier bedtime, the boundary with a specific person, the time you meant to protect for something that matters to you. Where do you say yes while secretly hoping someone will notice you wanted to say no, so that you won't have to be the one to say it? Where do you apologize for things that don't actually require an apology? For having a preference, for taking up space, for needing something from someone else? Where do you stay silent because disagreement feels dangerous, even in situations where the actual risk of speaking up is fairly small? Where do you make yourself smaller than you actually are, in order to preserve a relationship that might not survive you being your full size? Where are you waiting for someone else's permission or validation for a boundary you already know, somewhere inside yourself, that you need? None of these questions have a single correct answer, and none of them need to be resolved immediately. Their value is in the noticing itself, in bringing something that's been running quietly in the background into conscious view, where it can actually be examined and, if you choose, changed. Here's the principle underneath all of it. Respect from others often begins with the standards you consistently apply to your own behavior, not because other people are magically inspired by your self-respect and start mirroring it. That's not quite how it works, and expecting it to work that way sets you up for disappointment. It's more mechanical than that. Self-respect changes what you're willing to participate in. It changes which situations you stay in and which ones you quietly exit. It changes what gets a yes and what finally gets an honest no. And because your behavior is the thing other people are actually responding to, not your intentions, not your internal state, but the pattern they can observe. A change in your standards eventually shows up as a change in how you're treated, simply because you've stopped participating in the dynamics that produced the old treatment in the first place. It's worth being precise about what you're actually building toward, because it's easy, especially with a title as provocative as this one, to construct the wrong target in your head and aim for it by mistake. You're not building toward cold, not ruthless, not intimidating, not selfish, not unavailable, withdrawn, or perpetually guarded. Any of those would be a different problem, wearing the same costume as a solution, trading self-abandonment for a version of isolation that solves the original problem by creating a new one. Here's what you're actually building toward, and it's worth holding this description clearly, because it's the version of this material that actually integrates everything covered so far. Kind but clear. Generous, but selective about where that generosity flows, rather than distributing it indiscriminately regardless of how it's received. Patient, but not endlessly tolerant of the same disrespect repeated indefinitely. Forgiving, but not forgetful. Able to extend grace for a single mistake while still noticing an actual pattern when one develops. Calm, but not passive. Steady under pressure without being absent from the moment. Confident, but not arrogant. Sure of your own position without needing anyone else to be wrong in order to feel secure in it. Helpful, but not exploitable. able to give freely to people who treat that generosity with respect, without extending the same generosity automatically to people who don't. This is the healthier interpretation of the title this entire audiobook was built around. Not stop being kind. Rather, let your kindness have a spine. Let it be something you extend deliberately from a place of genuine choice, rather than something you perform automatically out of fear of what happens if you don't. None of this arrives as a single finished state you either have or don't have. It's closer to a direction than a destination. A set of small, ordinary choices repeated over time that gradually shift how you show up in your relationships. Some days you'll manage it more easily than others. Some situations will test it more than others. That's not evidence of failure. It's just what practicing something genuinely difficult actually looks like in real life, outside the tidy narrative of a single transformative moment. There's an old philosophical idea, developed centuries ago by thinkers who spent a great deal of time thinking carefully about exactly this problem, and it happens to map almost perfectly onto everything this audiobook has been building toward. You cannot control whether everyone in your life respects you. You cannot control whether someone approves of a boundary you've set, however reasonable it is. You cannot control whether someone misunderstands a decision you made with total honesty and good intent. You cannot control whether someone, faced with a version of you that no longer abandons itself on request, chooses to leave the relationship rather than adjust to it. All of that sits outside your control, and spending your energy trying to manage it directly, through more explaining, more accommodating, more anticipating what will keep everyone satisfied, is energy spent on something that was never actually yours to manage. What you can control is narrower, and also, it turns out, entirely sufficient, whether you betray yourself in an attempt to prevent those outcomes, whether you say what's true, even knowing it might not land the way you'd prefer, whether you hold a reasonable position, even under pressure to abandon it, whether you treat other people with basic decency, even while declining to give them everything they want from you. The old lesson, stated plainly: stop demanding control over other people's opinions of you. Start exercising control over your own conduct. Be reasonable. Be honest. Be disciplined about following through on what you say. Be kind. In the genuine sense this audiobook has spent so much time distinguishing from its imitation. But do not surrender your own principles simply because someone, somewhere, might dislike them. That surrender was never actually protecting you from anything durable. It was only ever buying a small, temporary peace, at a price that kept quietly increasing the longer you kept paying it. This isn't a call to stop caring what anyone thinks. Most people reasonably care what the people close to them think, and that care is part of what makes relationships meaningful rather than transactional. The distinction is between caring about someone's experience and being controlled by their potential disapproval. The first is connection. The second is self-abandonment dressed up as consideration. Learning to tell them apart, in the specific moment they show up, is most of what this entire audiobook has actually been about. Before we close, it's worth gathering a few of the questions this audiobook has offered along the way into something more portable. A small set of tools you can actually reach for in the moment, rather than having to reconstruct an entire philosophy each time a decision comes up. Before saying yes to something, ask, would I still choose this if I knew for certain that they wouldn't be disappointed by my no? If the honest answer is no, if the yes only exists because you're afraid of the alternative, that's worth noticing before you commit. Before apologizing, ask, did I actually do something wrong? Not did someone react badly? Not did tension appear in the room? Specifically, did I cause harm that warrants an apology, or am I apologizing simply because someone else is unhappy? Before accepting a pattern of disrespect, ask, If this happened repeatedly, with no response from me, what would my continued tolerance actually teach this person to expect? Before confronting someone about something, ask, am I protecting a boundary that genuinely matters to me, or am I trying to punish them for something else entirely? Before explaining yourself at length, ask, have I already communicated the point clearly enough? Is more explanation actually adding information, or is it just an attempt to secure their approval before I let myself have this boundary? And before feeling guilty about disappointing someone, ask, am I actually responsible for how they feel, or only for behaving fairly and honestly toward them? Those are different kinds of responsibility, and only one of them was ever really yours to carry. None of these questions are meant to be recited like a script in the middle of a conversation. That would just replace one kind of performance with another. They're meant to live quietly in the background, available when you need them, gradually becoming less like conscious questions and more like an instinct you don't have to think through step by step anymore. That's usually how any of this eventually settles. Not as a set of rules you're actively applying, but as a shift in how situations register the moment they happen. The title of this audiobook says, if nobody respects you, stop being nice. By now, hopefully, that title means something different than it did at the start. It doesn't mean stop being kind. It means stop being kind against yourself. Stop saying yes because you're afraid of what happens if you say no. Stop apologizing every time someone else is disappointed, as though their disappointment were automatically proof of your wrongdoing. Stop explaining your boundaries as though you're requesting permission for them to exist. Stop tolerating disrespect, repeated over and over, simply because confrontation makes you uncomfortable. Stop giving endlessly while secretly keeping a private tally that the other person was never shown. Stop confusing being needed with being valued. Two things that can look identical and mean something entirely different. Stop confusing being agreeable with being good, as though the two were the same quality wearing different names. And stop believing, even quietly, that your worth is measured by how comfortable everyone around you feels in your presence. The mature goal was never, how can I make people respect me? That question puts the entire outcome in someone else's hands, and someone else's hands were never a reliable place to leave something this important. The better question, the one this audiobook has been circling from the very first minute. How can I behave in a way that allows me to respect myself? Answer that question honestly, consistently, in the small ordinary moments where nobody else is even watching closely enough to notice the difference. And then let other people's reactions be whatever they turn out to be. Some relationships will get stronger. A few might not survive the change at all, and that, difficult as it can be in the moment, is usually information worth having rather than a loss worth mourning indefinitely. Most relationships, the healthy ones, will simply become clearer. A little more honest, a little steadier, built on something more solid than the accommodation that used to hold them together. Let's return to where we started. Maybe the problem was never that you were too kind. Maybe you were simply giving people access to you without giving your own boundaries equal importance in the arrangement. Offering your time, your patience, your forgiveness, freely and often, while quietly leaving out the part where those things also have limits. You don't need to become colder to fix that. You don't need to become harder or unreachable, or someone people learn to fear rather than someone people learn to trust. You need to become someone whose yes means yes and whose no means no, someone whose word, either direction, can actually be relied upon. Because it isn't quietly negotiable the moment someone pushes back on it. Someone who can help without resentment, building underneath the help. Someone who can disagree without panic taking over the moment disagreement appears. Someone who can hear another person's disappointment without immediately surrendering the position that produced it. Someone who can apologize sincerely when they're actually wrong and remain steady without excessive apology when they're not. Someone who can walk away from a situation that no longer serves them without needing the other person's agreement that leaving was justified. Return one more time to the question underneath everything this audiobook has explored. What are you willing to tolerate in exchange for being liked? Because that question, sat with honestly, tends to reveal the entire shape of the problem. If you find yourself constantly betraying your own needs, your own time, your own sense of what's reasonable, simply to keep someone else comfortable or pleased with you, it's worth asking, plainly, whether the price of that particular relationship, as currently arranged, has become too high. You can be kind, you can be generous, you can be patient, understanding, forgiving, all the qualities that make you someone worth knowing in the first place. None of that has to change, but kindness should be something you choose, deliberately, from a place of genuine desire to give. Not something you perform because you're quietly terrified of what happens the moment you stop. Here's the final reframe, the one worth carrying out of this audiobook and into the rest of your life. Respect doesn't begin when everyone else around you finally changes. It begins when your own behavior becomes clear. You say what you mean what you say. You keep reasonable boundaries communicated plainly, and you follow through on them consistently. You accept that some people, at some point, will be disappointed by that, and you let them be disappointed without retaliating, without becoming cruel, without needing to win anything from them. You simply stop abandoning yourself to prevent a feeling that was, all along, survivable. You don't have to stop being nice. You just have to stop using your niceness as the price of being accepted. Be kind. Be generous. Be compassionate. But let your kindness have a spine, something underneath it that holds its shape, even when someone pushes against it. Because the moment you realize that someone else's disappointment is something you can actually survive, you become far harder to manipulate, without ever having to become hard. And the moment you stop needing everyone's approval of your boundaries before you'll allow yourself to have them, you become far freer to actually live by them, not colder, not crueler, just clearer.